Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody here to this special briefing for members of parliament on the link between the wildlife trade and COVID-19, and particularly investigating the steps that should be taken by legislators to prevent similar events in the future. A special welcome to the members of parliament who's joining us, and a big thank you to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Environment, Honourable Caucus, for facilitating this meeting. Welcome also to the press, members of the public, and people working in the environmental field from all over the world who are joining us on our live YouTube channel. So this meeting follows a very similar event which was held with members of Congress in the USA, facilitated by the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. And similar meetings are also now planned for legislators in the UK, Europe, and Asia over the coming days. These legislators all belong to non-partisan environmental caucuses or groupings in 17 countries, of which 7 are in Africa. And these caucuses and groupings provide MPs across the political parties an opportunity to brainstorm on issues affecting the environment, as well as support them in the form of technical information and research. In the post-94 Parliament, a very similar caucus or grouping existed, of which I was part of, in the National Assembly. And we are really hoping that today's meeting or event will revive such a grouping, since I know that MPs agree that there has never been a more important time in terms of the environment than now. As you will hear today, there is little doubt that the crisis we are facing globally at the moment came about as a result of a jump by the COVID-19 virus from wild animals to humans. It therefore seems crucial that we investigate how to stop this from happening again in future. And since South Africa has shown immense leadership and courage in the manner which it continues to handle this crisis, it also seems appropriate that we should take the lead in ensuring that this does not happen again. So we have 2 internationally renowned experts who will talk to us today about this issue, after which we will give MPs the opportunity to ask questions. I want to remind MPs that they can indicate to me that they want to ask a question via the chat facility or else WhatsApping me. And you can do it anytime from now onwards, you can do that. So I want to welcome the first speaker for today, David Quammen. David is an internationally award-winning and top-selling author of many books on the environment, but it's particularly his book Spillover, which was already published a couple of years ago, that looks at the issue of how viruses jump from animals to humans, that has made him in such high demand over the last few weeks all over the world. David is in the USA and he got up very early to speak to us. Thank you for that, David. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you. I'm glad to be with you. Honorable members, Chair Casa, General, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you this morning, and I hope I can help in this conversation. Let me start with the very basic question. When we have a new virus that is causing misery and death in humans, it seems to have appeared out of nowhere. It had to come from somewhere. As Melanie mentioned, this current virus, the SARS-CoV virus, has come from a wild animal. The fact is that when there is a new virus in humans, it always comes from a wild animal. Viruses are parasites. They're not actually cellular creatures. They can only replicate themselves inside the body of another creature, an animal, a plant, a fungus. But when it comes to a virus that might infect humans, we can be sure that it comes from an animal. And in almost all cases, that means a wild animal. A virus comes from a wild animal into humans. We've never seen it before. We have no defenses against it, either in our immune systems or in our pharmacopoeia of treatments and vaccines. So there is a chance that it will, if it can replicate in humans and can transmit from human to human, there is a chance that it can cause an awful and spreading disease. When a virus does this, when it comes from a non-human animal into a human and causes disease, we call that a zoonotic disease, as in zoology. And this is not a strange little subject at the fringe of medicine. This is central. This is huge. The fact is that at least 60% of human infectious diseases fall into this category: zoonotic diseases, diseases that come to us from wild animals. There's a long drumbeat in the last 60 years of diseases that have gotten into humans this way. It goes back to Mapucho virus in Bolivia in 1961, Marburg virus coming with monkeys out of Uganda up to Marburg, Germany for medical research in 1967. Of course, we all know about Ebola virus emerging for the first time in 1976 and scattered times since then, causing terrible outbreaks in Central Africa and in particular West Africa in 2014. And then there was SARS in 2003, among others. That came out of a bat, spread from Hong Kong, got to Toronto, got to Bangkok, got to Singapore, and caused very dangerous outbreaks there. SARS was in the same family as this virus, this coronavirus. The coronaviruses are one of the groups of viruses at the top of the watch list. Why is that? That's because they have a history of infecting humans and causing disease outbreaks like SARS in 2003, and because they have the capacity to evolve relatively quickly. That's one of the things that makes a virus dangerous. If it has the chance, the opportunity, the ability to evolve relatively quickly once it gets into humans, then it can improve its transmission rate. It can learn, in the sense, how to transmit from one human to another. And it can potentially become a pandemic. Among the viruses that have that sort of capacity to evolve and to adapt, at the top of the list are first influenzas, and then other groups of viruses that include the coronaviruses. So when this event began in January of this year, some people were surprised. I wasn't surprised. Not because I'm prescient, but because 10 years ago, when I was researching my book, I talked to a select group of the world's best infectious disease scientists, and they told me, essentially, in a sort of a consensus form of what they told me, a composite of what they told me, when I asked them, will there be a next big one, a next big global pandemic? A composite of what they said was, yes, there will be a next big one. What will it look like? Well, it'll be caused by a virus. It'll be a virus new to humans. Where will that virus come from? It'll come from wild animals. What kind of wild animals? Well, for instance, possibly a bat. What kind of virus? Well, possibly an influenza virus or a coronavirus with high adaptability. How will this happen? The spillover. Spillover is the term for the moment when an animal virus passes into its first human victim, spilling over from one species to another. That's why my book is titled Spillover. How will the spillover happen? I asked the scientists. And they said, well, it'll happen because of close contact between humans and some kind of wildlife. What kind of close contact? Well, hunting, possibly. Capture of wild animals live, possibly. Transport of wild animals to a wet market where wild animals are sold live along with other domestic animals and other kinds of food, possibly in a wet market. Where might that be? Well, anywhere where wildlife is sold with other foodstuffs alive, for instance, in China. So this is what I heard 10 years ago. When this outbreak began, I was only surprised by one thing, and that was how unprepared many countries were, particularly including mine, the United States, to deal with this, because there had been warnings, and there continue to be warnings. Another thing that can be said about this is that when we get the COVID-19 pandemic under control, hopefully that will be not too long from now. When we get a vaccine, that may be a year from now. When we get this when we get past the worst of this and things start to come back to normal, it's very important that we not forget and that we understand that this COVID-19 epidemic, pandemic, as terrible as it is not an independent event. It's not something that has simply happened to us. It reflects things that we have been doing. What have we been doing to contribute to the likelihood of a pandemic like this? Well, a number of things, beginning with contact with wild animals, hunting, live capture, what is called when Westerners, particularly Western conservationists, talk about capture and killing and eating of wild animals, when they talk about that happening in Africa, they call it bushmeat, and there's a little bit of a negative onus. I live in Montana, surrounded by forest and mountains and deer and elk. When we kill wild animals for food, we call it game. Is that fair or unfair? It's silly. It's the same thing. And we're not talking about a moral valence on that. We're talking about practicalities and risks to human populations, whether they're in Montana or in Africa or in China, wherever they are. So hunting, killing, capture of wild animals is one of the things that we humans do to potentially begin these outbreaks with the spillover moment. But it's not the only thing that we do. All of the choices that we make, what we're going to eat, what we buy, what we wear, what we consume. For instance, if we have a cell phone, we are consumers of the mineral coltan, which comes from just a few places, including the southeastern corner of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. How many children we have, if we have children, how much we travel. All of these factors put pressure on the natural world, draw wild animals toward us, cause humans to enter into highly diverse ecosystems, to cut timber, to mine for minerals, to capture or kill wildlife. All of those things we all share in the responsibility, and I try and remind people of that whenever I get the opportunity. If you own a cell phone, you are a customer for tantalum coming from mines in the southeastern corner of DRC, and that asks people to go in and mine in an area of high diversity, and they're going to have to eat. What are they going to eat? Are they going to eat only rice and fufu? No, they're going to eat protein too. Brings them in contact with wild animals. So I will stop there for now and be happy to answer any questions you have. But that's, I think, the best way that I can contribute by framing the beginning of this conversation. Melanie?
Thank you, David. Again, I'm going to remind MPs they can ask questions on the side, just indicate to me. We're going to do the questions and answers after the next speaker. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Nick King. When I asked him how I should describe him, he said, and I have to read this carefully, as an environmental futurist, global change and analyst, and development policy strategist. You see, if you don't understand what that means, I didn't either. So I went back to him and said, yeah, but what do you actually do? And from what I understand is that he does many things, but amongst others, he works with NGOs and governments on issues such as climate change, water, biodiversity, sustainability, etc. And he also lectures at various universities in South Africa. Nick is joining us from the Baviaans Kloof in the Eastern Cape, where he was lucky enough to get stuck when lockdown started. Nick, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Melanie, and good afternoon, Chair and honourable members. And if I may take the liberty of using a South Africanism, all protocols observed, hopefully. Thanks for the opportunity, Melanie, and to talk to everybody. I hope the sound is okay, is it? And so I'd like to just follow up with what David was saying and just say, this isn't the first and it surely won't be the last zoonotic pandemic that we're going to see. We're starting to see them erupt more frequently. And the fact that this one spilt over in Asia is largely irrelevant. It could have just as easily happened in Africa. And overall, the United Nations Environment Programs, they have a thing called Frontiers Report, which looks at emerging environmental issues. They estimate that the 75% of all emerging infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic. In other words, they come across from animals of some sort. And that's not just wildlife, obviously, it's also domestic animals. So it's our proximity to and use of animals, essentially, which allows zoonotic diseases to transfer to us. So the next pandemic could arise anywhere. You know, we're not through this one yet, but we're talking about what could we maybe do better. It could arise right here in South Africa. If indeed the virus, this coronavirus, was transferred from bats to pangolins as the intermediate host, those pangolins could very easily have been illegally trafficked from South Africa. Pangolins are mostly trafficked live. I don't know if people know that, because they have the tendency to roll up in a ball when threatened, and then they're easy to pick up. They just get wrapped in masking tape for transportation, and they can be kept alive for a week or two like this, which means they continue to carry all of their own diseases, as well as being able to be infected because they are still alive when they get to the market, mostly in other parts of the world. They're also obviously highly stressed and weakened, which makes them all more susceptible to infection. Quite apart from the horrific cruelty of this live trade, of course. And, you know, pangolins are listed under Appendix 1 on the CITES Convention. That means there is, or supposedly, no commercial trade in pangolins. And yet they are the most trafficked mammal in the world. IUCN estimates are over 1 million pangolins are trafficked every year. In South Africa, the latest stats were that we've recorded less than 50 incidents of pangolin poaching, or for the past 5 years, each year for the past 5 years, with just 28 prosecutions. So obviously not all those million come from South Africa, but the illegal trade is obviously evading detection quite substantially. So where are we then? In terms of what do we do? The wildlife markets, there's been some calls now to ban them. And this is an issue for food security and both food safety, resulting in both of which compromise human health. Trafficking of wildlife is always going to risk us to exposure to the diseases they may harbor, but that's both our livestock and our wildlife, as I said. And when we have markets where many species of wild animals and often domestic ones too are sort of crowded together in unhygienic and highly stressful conditions, and they're often slaughtered right there on the premises. There are crowds of people coming through, obviously the shoppers, the vendors, and so on. And this provides ideal circumstances for transmission of these diseases. We've heard a lot of talk about wet markets, but it's not wet markets per se that are the problem, and you can't simply ban these markets. That would be almost impossible without providing food system alternatives for people. Many millions of people depend on food markets, obviously. And wet markets trade a range of fresh produce. Some of them are just fruit and vegetables, for example. Others have that and fish and livestock. And sometimes they have wildlife. There's by no means all wet markets that have wildlife. But it's this bringing together of all of these different species together with humans in these types of conditions, which provide the perfect conditions for transmission. Simple bans would obviously not be good then, without having alternatives for food for people and where to source them and so on. And simple bans could actually do more harm than good for wildlife, for biodiversity, because it could drive the trade underground. And that trade would probably become more sophisticated and more lucrative. And so I want to touch on this illegal wildlife trade because it's a huge portion of this. An Interpol report in 2016, there may be an update, I'm not sure, estimated the global wildlife trade to be in the region of about $236 billion a year. That's a huge criminal enterprise. It's about double the figure of global overseas development aid, annual overseas development aid. So this illegal exploitation of our wildlife for overseas markets is simply a stealing of our natural resources. And it's an undermining of our economy and our neighbors in Africa, if we want to talk about Africa. And it's funding organized international crime syndicates with all of the attendant negatives that go with that. The illegal wildlife trade is linked to the illegal trade in drugs, illegal trade in weapons, the human trafficking networks, and it's being used to fund militias and wars in many parts of Africa in particular. So we need to vastly expand our capacity to curtail the illegal trade in wildlife and wildlife products, both in and out of South Africa, as part of our preparation to prevent future pandemics. It's also, of course, decimating our unique wildlife, as we know, with things like rhino and elephant poaching. It's killing our conservation agency staff, our rangers who put their lives on the line. And it's making us spend enormous amounts of money on security to try and prevent this, which all impacts negatively on our economy. It also impacts hugely negatively on our tourism potential if we lose these iconic wildlife. And of course, as tourism disappears, we know many rural communities where tourism occurs, ecotourism, will have to turn to poaching to survive. And this will increase their exposure potentially to these types of diseases. So we need to actually urgently provide financial support during the current COVID pandemic to this tourism sector to enable people to maintain their livelihoods, which have fallen away now that there is no tourism. And that's absolutely critical, because we've heard some talk about with our stimulus package, we can take money from the tourism sector because there is no tourism occurring. But in actual fact, we need to be investing in that sector because it can't sustain itself. And we don't want it to collapse because it would take years, decades to try and build it up again. And it's a thriving sector and employs tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people in South Africa. So South Africa is also a sort of major trafficking hub for the illegal wildlife trade, especially through OR Tambo, but also through our ports. And so, as Melanie was saying, whilst we've been a leader in an early lockdown and responding to this pandemic, we also need to be a leader in trying to prevent future pandemics from occurring and spreading. And we can do that by enhancing our security services and our customs and border posts in trying to address this, because by definition, this illegal trade is an international and transboundary problem. And so it needs unprecedented cooperation, international cooperation. It can't be done by a single country alone. Of course, with this, we're not talking about criminalizing local sustainable use of natural resources. Many of these activities are legal, they're regulated, they're essential for people's livelihoods, and they don't really pose any significant threat to human health and biodiversity. What we, in fact, with greater investment into proven local conservation strategies, with local communities such as locally owned conservancies, our neighbor Namibia is a wonderful success story. We could even expand this aspect of food security, of biodiversity conservation, of tourism, and even things like water conservation in these areas. So we're talking here about the illegal and unregulated trade, the closure of illegal and unregulated markets, the minimizing of the live trade, and in fact our overall meat consumption as humanity. And ensuring greater food safety measures, obviously, to reduce risk. So to come to a point which David raised, this is all about overall our overall relationship with nature and the natural world. It's about a more comprehensive management of our environment as we seek development and uplifting of people. We totally depend on the environment for clean water, clean air, productive soils for agriculture, fisheries and forestry, and of course biodiversity and tourism. And we need to try and ensure that we stop destroying nature through our consumptive activities. So David touched on this a little bit about cell phones and so on, but United Nations Environment Program produced a report last year called the Global Resources Outlook, and it showed that more than 80% of biodiversity loss around the world is attributable to the extractive sector. So that's mining, it's industrial agriculture. So we need to address the sector's rapacious destruction of nature, because that's where we're getting a lot of the exposure to these new and novel zoonotics. So this increasing sort of habitat destruction and industrial agriculture play key roles in increasing potential zoonotic disease exposure and transmission from wildlife to people and or to domestic livestock. And so these are things that we need to really rethink in terms of preparedness and risk aversion, reducing our risk to future pandemics. So we need some strong strategic measures to be taken to safeguard and fund the conservation of our natural resources, and indeed even restore these degraded ecosystems. The UNEP report states that the ecosystem functions on which the health of wildlife, of people, and of the planet depend must be restored and safeguarded. We've seen with COVID-19 how we can respond to crises when we must. And we really need to respond to the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis in a similar manner, because they're all interlinked. Climate change is going to make diseases expand their ranges much more quicker. And we need to treat these all as one interlinked crisis that we need to deal with. This pandemic is a real tragedy, but we need to use it as a unique opportunity to create a more equitable and sustainable future. And equitable is for those members of our population who have compromised immune systems, who have poor health and poor nutrition, because this makes all of them more vulnerable to the disease. And by taking this more comprehensive management of the environment, we'll be moving towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, which actually stress all of these targets there, and the need to address them all together. So just to wrap it up quickly, there's a huge opportunity here with our pandemic stimulus packages to really put a lot of that into growing the sectors that we need to grow in order to redress some of these problems that have caused the pandemic, to restore these ecosystems back to health, to grow our biodiversity conservation and our water catchments, secure our water catchments, to address climate change through investing in green energy sources, and take a more holistic view of the way that we interact with our planet. And I'll stop there, Melanie, and very happy to pick up on any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that. I'm going to open the floor. The chairperson will come in at the end, but of course he's also welcome to ask a question at this stage if he wants to. I'm going to, I'm looking at who's asked, whether they can, who's indicated that they would like to ask some questions. So I'm first going to go to the Honorable Singh, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you very much to the Wilderness Foundation and ICCF for hosting this wonderful program, and to you, Melanie, as well. And thank you to David and Prof. King for the very thought-provoking addresses. Professor used the word opportunity quite a few times in his presentation. And, you know, I've heard from my grandfather that you must look for a seed of a hidden opportunity in every adversity. And I think now is the time for us to look for those seeds of opportunity. And if the greatest beneficiaries, as far as we are concerned at the moment, is in abstract terms the environment. But I think our challenge as members of Parliament, Honourable Chairperson of our committee, is how do we keep these environmental gains from slipping away? Because they can very easily slip away when we have a vaccine and we forget that COVID-19 never happened. So having said that, I've got two questions. The first question would be, David's spoken about COVID-19 being a zoonotic disease. I think we all know that. Has it been proven beyond doubt that COVID-19 emanated from wildlife? Is it a zoonotic disease? Because there are so many theories, conspiracy theories out there. And, you know, I'd really like to know whether there has been any studies done in that regard. The second question would relate to, it's encouraging to see that some of the Asian countries are closing markets. How do we, as South African legislators, influence changes in legislation and regulation in our own country to ensure that in future we can control the wildlife trade? We've been talking about lion bone trade, hunting, canned lion hunting, and the chairman is well aware of these things, but we haven't got to grips with it. So how do you suggest we do that, not only in a South African level, but also with CITES? What influence can we have at CITES to see what we can do from our side? Thank you very much.
Melanie, I would suggest I could answer the first question and leave it to Nick to answer the second question.
That's perfect. Go ahead, David.
Is that all right? Thank you, honorable member. Yes, there have been questions raised, and there should be questions raised about every aspect of this, including the question about whether this virus, SARS-CoV-2, did in fact spill over from wildlife. The evidence is very, very strong. Science is always a provisional process, but there is certainty that this virus came from a wild animal, certainly from a bat, ultimately, possibly, as Nick said, by way of a pangolin as an intermediate or amplifier host. There is a scientific team at the Wuhan Institute of Virology led by Dr. Shengli Shi, who have been studying coronaviruses in bats of China for the last 10 years. And they have been finding coronaviruses in bats in the province of Hubei, but also in the province of Yunnan, and sequencing the genomes of those viruses. And they have been finding some that are similar to the SARS virus from 2003, others not quite so similar. They found one in 2015 that looked like it had particular potential to infect humans because it has a capacity to seize on a particular molecule on the outside of human respiratory cells and get into human respiratory cells, seize on a receptor and get into human respiratory cells. They published a paper in 2017, including the genome of this particular virus. And they said, we should be aware of this. We should be prepared for this. There is a pandemic threat from a virus of this sort. Now we have the COVID-19 virus. Its genome was sequenced in early January, and one sample of the one sample was sequenced by this particular team at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It essentially is identical to the other samples from humans that have been sequenced of this new virus. This new virus is 96% similar in its genome to the virus that they warned about back in 2017, about 80% similar to SARS. So this virus, and the scientists who study evolutionary virology around the world, including a team led by a fellow named Christian Anderson, an American, published an article in Nature Medicine during January. They looked at the possibility that this virus might have been engineered in a lab, and they said there is no possibility that this virus has been engineered in a lab. We can see from the genome sequence that this virus did indeed come ultimately from a bat, some possibility that it might have been mediated by a pangolin, zero possibility that it was artificially created from pieces of other viruses in a laboratory. So yes, there is very, very strong evidence that this is a virus that came from a wild animal, although there are rumors, and there will always be rumors and conspiracy theories and paranoid imaginings that this is something that was either designed in a Chinese laboratory intentionally or designed by the CIA and released. Those rumors are out there, but the scientific evidence based on molecular comparison of the genomes tells us that this is a bat virus that might have spent a few years in a pangolin.
Thank you, David. Nick?
Yeah, great. Thanks, thanks, Melanie. And yeah, just try and say in a one-liner there, so all of the credible scientific evidence points to it being zoonotic, from originating from bats and an intermediary species, and absolutely no credible scientific evidence exists currently for any alternative explanation. So hopefully we can put that to bed. Just in terms of sort of regulations in South Africa and so on, I think, you know, we have extremely good environmental legislation in South Africa, and particularly NEMA. What we don't tend to do, though, is we don't tend to invest in this environmental legislation sufficiently, and we don't tend to invest in the enforcement of those regulations sufficiently. If we look at our GDP and the economy and so on, tourism, I think, is the second biggest contributor. And the National Biodiversity Assessment report that came out last year showed that there was something like 436,000, I think, jobs directly linked to the biodiversity sector. It's equivalent to the same number of jobs in the mining sector. Yet, do we see an equivalent investment? No, we don't. So, you know, the challenge is on us as a country, third most biodiverse country in the world. It's a huge tourism attractor. We have beautiful, unique landscapes. We have this amazing diversity. We have the Cape Floral Kingdom, but we don't invest in it. We don't value it in the way we should. And if we did, you know, we would invest in the restoration of these biodiverse regions in our national parks, in habitats, in corridors connecting them, and so on. And we could generate many, many more jobs by investing in that sector as well. We have some great examples of the Extended Public Works Program, the Working for Water program, for example, working for wetlands. And those have shown, you know, working for water, that we've saved ourselves hundreds of millions of rands in water losses through the clearing of invasive alien plants. And these are all parts of that biodiversity and environmental restoration that we need to be investing in as a country. I think just there was a mention of the lion bone trade. You know, we really need to examine what it is that we're trying to do here. There's been considerable work done around the lion bone trade that shows there's absolutely no conservation value whatever in that industry. In fact, it only has negative impacts in terms of conservation. There is inbreeding amongst those lions in captivity. There are terrible concerns around animal welfare of those lion breeding facilities and so on. And that it impacts negatively on South Africa's reputation as a country. It impacts negatively on our tourism sector. And there's absolutely no benefit to doing it. And it's also potentially exposing people to zoonotic diseases, both in South Africa and in those countries that we export those wildlife products to. So, you know, why do we then allow such a trade to function? There are only negatives associated with it. So I think we really do need to question our motives around some of these, this commodification of our wildlife and our natural environment, where we see them simply as something to be exploited, or almost as though we manufacture them in a factory and then we ship them off overseas. But of course, these are wild animals, live animals. They are sentient beings, and they have the potential to harbor some of these diseases which can trip over. There was a mention of CITES. Yes, CITES. You know, maybe there are a lot of questions about CITES and its functionality these days. It's about 40, 50 years old now, CITES, and it's maybe just a tool that's no longer fit for purpose unless there is significant more funding going into it to enable it to be to enforce all of the regulations that fall under it. There's just too many loopholes in those regulations. There's too much ability for countries to shift wildlife, for example, under Appendix 1 through false certification, through a third-party country, and enable that trade. And so we need to get both countries of origin and countries of demand to really sit down and ratify and really invest in CITES if it's going to be effective. Currently, it really isn't very effective. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Nick. I am seeing, I've noticed that Honorable Winkler, Honorable Paulson, I've seen you. I'm just queuing it up as it comes through to me. So I'll go next to Honorable Mbata. Honorable Mbata, are you there? Oh, hold on, Honorable Mbata, the microphone is mute, so there we go. Can you just start your question again, please?
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, I have some few questions. The first thing is that, yes, South Africa has got good legislation, but we need to assist the government on the enforcement of those legislation, especially when the professor talk of the NEMA Act. We can have it, but how do we ensure the enforcement of compliance? That's where we should start to discuss so that we assist the department. And the other thing is not, to me, it's not only the one department that should look at us. It must be a joint departmental collaboration, because there's a mining industry, there's the agricultural industry, there's environment and other department that needs to have a collaboration and to look at how best can we reduce this. Because you need to know, us as Africans, we've got traditional healers, of which they use some of these wild animals, some of the plants for their as their medicine. So, and we also need to educate them and enforce and try and enforce the compliance of the legislation, because it's very important. If you check on the pangolin, some of the traditional practitioners, they use it. And once we don't train them on how the contamination mode is, then there's a problem. Because if you look, I look quickly on how the transmission mode is. It's through the fecal material, urine, blood, and bloody fluids. So these are the things they must guide against whenever they have those things. And I think also the permits, we need to have permits for the wildlife, for the animals. But as South Africans, we need to sit down and check how best can we reduce this zoonotic disease infection. And while we are talking about this, I now remember the lion capturing for hunting, of which when it was presented to us as a portfolio committee of environmental affairs, forest and fisheries, one of the things that we found out is that how they slaughtered the animal, I mean, how they kill those lions. They shoot them and they are lying there on the floor. There's no flow of blood. When I'm talking about the killing, it must be done properly in an approved abattoir, because there are things that needs to be done before you can do anything, the killing of the animals. But what shocked me is that meat was being donated or given to the Black people, families that are living around that area. And I asked the question, how do they know that that meat is not infected? Because it was not inspected. There's no meat inspectors. There's nothing. So it's very broad, and we need to sit down and come up with a strategy on how best can we deal with this thing. Because if you look at the lion breeding and hunting, they're making money. It's being shipped all over the country. Some of the the parts of those lions are being shipped to other countries. But these are the things that we should look at it to say how best can we do it. And we love our wild animals, but there are those also people who take the wild animals and keep them as pets. Because if you look at the mode of contamination, spread of contamination, it's feces, the urine, the blood. Are those people trained? Do they have permits? Are they trained on how best can they avoid the zoonotic the spillover, just like David said? But that's what, in short, that I wanted to do. And I'm very much disturbed when we have such good legislation in South Africa, especially the environmental health legislation. If you combine them with environmental management legislation, including Occupational Health and Safety Act, those are very good pieces of legislation. But we need to have more people to assist us with the enforcement. Like we have them in the Department of Environmental Affairs, but there are few. There are few to do that. And we have the environmental health practitioners also from the Department of Health. There are very few. So let's increase the people, the HR to assist us with the enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mbata. I'm not sure, I mean, I think all of those points are well taken. I don't know if, Nick, you want to briefly comment on any of those, or, yeah?
Yeah, look, well, I think the Honorable Mbata answered her own question at the end there, which is really, it's about the capacity to enforce, the legislation, the regulations. We have environmental management inspectors, but we don't have enough. We have officials at national and in each provincial agency, but we don't have enough. We don't have enough capacity in the sector. So, it comes back to my earlier point that we really do need to invest in the sector to enhance it and ensure that this great legislation we have actually is effective. I think there's a couple of other things. I don't want to take too long. Yes, it has to be done across sectors, and so the environmental impact assessment legislation needs to be enforced across the mining sector and the agricultural sector and so on, so that they don't impact negatively on our environment and on our water resources and so on. The traditional healers, yes, we know that, and I mentioned earlier that we don't want to shut down those types of uses, but it does need to be better regulated in terms of actually understanding what the extent of that use is and what people are using them for and whether that's sustainable and all of those sorts of things. So I think at this point it's really this capacity issue that we need to put in place, which is critical. I don't know if David wants to talk briefly to the transmission side, but I guess we're running a little bit out of time now.
Yeah, no, I can't add anything useful on that. Certainly it all makes very good sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Honorable Winkler, if you would like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in a very engaging and important discussion, which I do think is long overdue, considering that there was ample forewarning from experts, in exotic viruses and in epidemiology that foresaw this inevitable spillover happening. So I think from a South African context, what is particularly concerning for me is the way in which the human environmental relationship is framed in terms of sustainable use, but sustainable understood more in terms of exploitative use than sustainability with a stewardship component. So for me, that is actually very concerning. And I know Professor Nick King did speak about CITES, but it is something that I have asked the minister on is, will there be a revision of the live export of wild animals or wildlife to foreign markets? Because as we know, I say the intermediary here may have been the pangolin. We don't know if that was in fact trafficked from Africa, South Africa. And how do we go about preventing this kind of spillover in the future? And it seems to me that there needs to be a complete revision of the export of wildlife, except in very particular circumstances pertaining to, I think, conservational outcomes. But I can't see any other motivating factor being justifiable given the huge costs that can be incurred in the long run in terms of the global pandemic that we see at the moment. I did also want to mention that, you know, well, how do David and Professor Nick King see us sort of putting preventative measures in place long-term to prevent future spillover from occurring? And for me, I think it has to do with the fundamental shift in understanding on the relationship between human beings and the environment again. And I think that speaks to the role of stewardship as opposed to exploitation. And also, I do think that something that plays a very big role in this is definitely the allocation of resources globally, the global north, the global south, and then, you know, within South Africa as well. The fact that you have people that have resources and access to certain types of foods and protein, and others that have to, for instance, rely on game and bushmeat. So it's also about, I think, creating a more egalitarian society so that people have alternative options, that they don't have to perhaps rely on, you know, the illegal wildlife trade for food and for income, which I think is a large part of it. And then also, I do think that the issue on commercial farming, factory farming is a huge issue as well. And I think that that's often overlooked because of the sort of cultural attachments that come, you know, with it. It's a kind of a taboo subject. But I do think that there needs to be a conversation about moving away from, I think, factory farming of proteins, animal proteins, because they do create the very perfect environment for to occur that we've seen, like with SARS, you know, and factory farm chickens, for instance. So I think that's a difficult conversation that needs to be had. So I'd just like to know from the experts, you know, what sort of measures they would like to see put in place to prevent a further outbreak in the future. Thank you.
David, would you like to go first?
Yes, I'll start. Just say briefly, honorable member, thank you for that. And in terms of preventive measures, one of the things that I think we should think about, and that's most urgent, is preventing spillovers from becoming outbreaks, preventing outbreaks from becoming epidemics, preventing epidemics from becoming pandemics. In other words, it's inevitable that humans will have contact with wild animals. And often that will be at the subsistence level, of very reasonable, sustainable interaction between humans and wildlife in the circumstances of hunting or whatever. Those are the opportunities for spillover when a new virus, for instance, passes from its animal host into the first human being. Those are going to continue to happen. There's almost nothing that we can do except rebalancing our relationship with the world of nature in a general sense, but those will continue to happen. What we can do that's practical and feasible is to create networks of surveillance so that when a new virus does spill over into a human and a handful of people become infected, a few dozen become sick, a few hundred even, and a few dozen dead, there will be immediate reaction to that. Scientists around the world will know that there is a spillover with a cluster of disease that has occurred in Hubei province, China, or in eastern DRC, or in the southwest of the United States. Immediately, there will be sampling to find out what kind of a virus this is. There will be test kits created quickly. There will be platform vaccines that will be modified to become specific vaccines, platform therapies modified, and by platform, I mean a generalized starting point on a vaccine or a therapy that can be modified for a particular virus in a short period of time. Diagnostic kits that can be produced in great volume very quickly. All of these reactions that involve science and technology dispersed to all parts of the world with international networks of cooperation to detect these things when they begin so that they can be contained before they spread, before an outbreak of Ebola in a village in southeastern Guinea turns into an epidemic in 3 countries in West Africa that ends up killing 11,000 people. That's one of the things that we can do. Spillovers can occur, but we can stop them from turning into pandemics with global cooperation at the scientific, technological, and public health level.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, great. Thanks for those questions. I think they really do raise a couple of issues at a sort of more strategic level, and I think it's important to acknowledge that we are increasing the sort of perfect conditions for these types of pandemics. We have more and more people on the planet. We have more and more people living in urbanized environments, in informal settlements where people don't have any spacing. They have compromised health systems and so on, compromised nutrition. And we have the global travel and trade, which means you can be anywhere else in the world within sort of 24 hours at least. And so the disease can too. It goes where we go and where our goods go. We're in fact the perfect host for these zoonoses, and they're absolutely loving the way that we've made ourselves a perfect host and enabled it to travel around, if I can be a bit tongue in cheek there. So I think we need to do things like apply the precautionary principle. We know now that this is being enhanced by the way that we've set up our global trade, travel, and economic system. So let's try and cut back on some of those things at the point of the chain that we can. And the point of that chain is really the human-wildlife interaction. First of all, in getting out into the environment and destroying habitat and exposing ourselves to new wildlife habitats and new diseases and hosts potentially. And the second is the illegal wildlife trade. We have to break that link in the chain because that's where most of this is happening, and the vast majority of that trade is illegal, like I was showing with I mean, David's point's absolutely correct around our ability to detect and so on. And so I think in 2017, under the AU and President Ramaphosa was instrumental in this, we set up the African Center for Disease Control. And what's been great about that is that's enabled the response in African countries to take best practice and implement, for example, lockdown that very rapidly. So that's a crucial part of being able to respond. But we need to try and prevent it. Prevention is the cure here. And we know where the key points in this chain are, and we need to be investing our resources into preventing that ability to contact these, be exposed to, and our vulnerability to that exposure. And that's an absolutely critical thing for us to put in place going forward.
Thank you very much. Honorable Paulson. Honorable Paulson, are you there? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, Professor King. Thank you, David, for the presentation. I'd like to David, you've done this workshop with members of the US Congress, and you're doing it with us. And we've learned now, no matter where a virus emanates from, whether it's from Africa, whether it's from China, it's going to affect the entire world. I mean, it's China sneezed, and we all have are at the risk of contracting coronavirus. So, other than advocacy that organizations like the ICCF does, isn't there a better way for us to ensure that in future there would be greater international laws governing the trade of the hunting and the trade of wildlife? We know CITES exist, but it's not been effective because we do see them going and catching pangolin meat, if that is where it's come from. Some people say it's a bat, so even that sounds scary that someone would want to eat an animal like that. So, it's but of course there are people who find that attractive or who have a taste for it. So what other ways are there for us to strengthen and to protect ourselves from being exposed to viruses that come by animals? Because it could even be from livestock, like foot and mouth can spill over to humans. We can be infected. We saw with swine flu as well. So other than advocacy and what exists, what more can be done to protect people across the world from risk of infection? And then Professor King, also, yeah, in South Africa, for example, is the act like the NEMA Act, is that sufficient? Does it have enough to protect us even here from the risk of exposure to zoonotic viruses as well? Thank you very much.
I jump in very briefly and then pass it to Nick.
Absolutely, fine.
Thank you, Honorable Paulson, for the questions. You all know much better than I do how difficult it is to pass laws, even in a parliament, even in a Congress, and of course, passing international laws is much more difficult than that. And Nick has mentioned the difficulties with CITES and enforcing CITES. So I share your sense that that would be ideal. I don't see that as being a hopeful avenue, passing international laws, but passing international compacts of cooperation for surveillance and for reaction, I think is a real possibility. And as someone mentioned earlier, I think it was one of the honorable members, there is a principle that's been voiced by American politicians as well as some of the wise people, in other places, and that is, let no crisis go to waste. So we have a crisis here, and when this crisis is under control, I think there's an opportunity, a perverse opportunity, but a real opportunity to pivot from it and get new levels of international cooperation. Probably not enforceable laws, although I'm not the one to judge that, but international compacts of cooperation at the scientific and public health levels for fast reaction of the sort that I mentioned before, so that this pandemic wouldn't have been a pandemic. It would have been an outbreak in the city of Wuhan with international teams helping Chinese teams from the Chinese CDC to react to this quickly and contain it. Likewise, the West African Ebola epidemic wouldn't have been an epidemic. It would have been an outbreak in the village of Meliandou in southeastern Guinea, to which international cooperation would have flowed to help the Guineans to deal with this, strengthening their public health system in advance and giving them support to deal with it at a time when it was still localized. That's just a glimpse of the thoughts that I have, but I think that that's what it needs to be, is voluntary international cooperation at a much higher level of information flow and resource sharing than we have at the present time. Nick?
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie, and thanks to the honourable member. I think those are very pertinent questions. Is NEMA sufficient? If NEMA were enforced to the letter of the law, it could be, but NEMA's intention is not really to prevent outbreak of disease and so on, but it is about environmental management and improved environmental stewardship. And I think you mentioned CITES, as I had done, and CITES would help us deal with the illegal wildlife trade if we were to enforce it and strengthen it and really work hard on closing those loopholes. But we have another convention, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the one which is intended to conserve biodiversity, to restore biodiversity, and put this ethos of stewardship in place for the planet as a whole. But I think what David touched on is the critical one, is that we're unfortunately in a phase of global governance which prevents us actually negotiating solutions for transboundary problems. we're seeing nation states and particularly the US under the current administration pulling away from these negotiations, the Climate Change Convention and so on, and not enabling us to deal with them as transboundary problems. And they are all transboundary problems, whether we're talking about the wildlife trade or climate change and so on. We can't do this as nation states all looking for their own self-interest. So there needs to be a much greater collaborative, cooperative ethos in these multilateral environmental treaty negotiations. And that's, at this point in the 21st century, that's what I think we would have expected as humanity. And unfortunately, we've seen ourselves go the other way. So there's going to need to be a push from the leadership, the political leadership of countries around the world to say, we cannot go this alone. We cannot deal with these transboundary issues on our own. We can only do so cooperatively. And if that needs to be the sort of soft law approach initially that David was mentioning, well, so be it. But at least we'll make some progress that way. But currently, we are not negotiating in good faith, if you like, as a global community. And unless we change that, we're really not going to get on top of these transboundary crises that are rapidly increasing, as we said, simply because of all of the drivers are increasing, whether it's our population or the frequency of trade or the speed of trade and so on. So I think it's a crisis of leadership at this point, honourable member, as well, to actually implement what we know we need in terms of cooperative governance around the world.
Thank you very much, Nick. I have 3 more people that have indicated questions. I'm conscious that we've gone over 3 o'clock now. So I'm going to allow that to be, and sorry if there's anybody else that wanted to ask a question. The 2 speakers will still be able to answer also some questions if we put that into writing to them. I want to ask Honorable Mabeletsa next, and then Honorable Tungwana, if you can be ready, and then Honorable Boshoff. So Honorable Mabeletsa first.
Thank you. Mine is brief. Thank you. Thank you so much. Mine is brief. COVID-19 has triggered action that have public health benefits and the value of having one health approach. Do you think there is a possibility of that happening globally? Because we are now talking about one vaccine. Let me not say too much. Yeah.
And who would like to answer that?
Nick, do you want to take that?
Look, I'm happy to just say in broad terms, yes, the One Health approach is gaining a lot of traction, and it is the right way to go, where we see ourselves as part of the environment and that we are interacting with wildlife and so on, and these diseases can jump between us, as we now know only too well. So we do need to take a One Health approach, and that's a very positive outcome of the current pandemic, if you like. And we don't want to lose those gains. That's one of the critical issues out of this pandemic. It's a crisis and it's tragic, yes, but it's also an opportunity to get right some of these things and have a more egalitarian approach to the global community. So that One Health approach is highly laudable, and really we mustn't let those gains slip after this.
Thank you very much. Honorable Tungwana.
Thank you, Melanie. Mine is directed to David. I just wanted to check with him after learning that in your research, David, that the pandemic will arise. Do you think there was enough awareness raising so as to help the countries to prepare themselves? Thank you.
Honorable member, was there enough awareness raising? Well, there were efforts. Scientists, such as the scientists I mentioned at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, EcoHealth Alliance, which is an organization based in New York, scientists all over the world who study diseases were aware of these dangers, and they were speaking as loudly as they could. And there were people such as myself who worked to amplify scientific voices for the general public. We were talking about this. The warnings were there. The warnings were not heeded by some countries. Again, my own country has shown itself very poorly, I think, in this, in terms of leadership, in terms of political leadership. Political leaders have a duty to to their constituents and to their country, to balance different warnings and different risks. And in some places, political leadership is averse to the risk of spending money to prepare for an event that will eventually happen, but might or might not happen during their watch, during their term of office. I think that's what's happened in the United States. That's one of the reasons why we were very ill prepared. To be prepared takes a lot of money and takes political capital for an event that might or might not happen on your watch. And therefore, the political leadership in my country, the current political leadership, was averse, and they started dismantling our preparedness over the last 2 years. In other countries, your country has done much better. Singapore has done much better. South Korea has done much better. The city-state of Hong Kong did better. Warnings were there from the scientists. Public health people knew. Political leadership was needed, and was visionary political leadership was needed, and was only there in some countries and not in others.
Thank you, Honorable Boshoff. And then after that, I will make an exception, and I think everybody will forgive me. The General also wants to ask a question. So General, after Honorable Boshoff, I will put you on. Honorable Boshoff.
Thank you, Melanie. I want to raise a concern that this whole pandemic and the response that we should, sanitize our hands every 5 minutes nearly, could lead to the idea or the notion that people isolate themselves from ecology rather to integrate themselves into ecology. And I'm also concerned about what I would call warfare against microbiology. I mean, everything that goes on Earth, especially sewerage works, depends on microbiology. But those are the very organisms which are targeted by, I would say, a near crusade against anything on you that could live. While without them we can't live. How do we get away from this kind of warfare against the ecology of which we are an integral part?
Thank you. I don't know who wants to answer that, David or Nick?
I'll jump in briefly. That as we continue our efforts of public education, among others, we need not to demonize microbiology. We need to elevate microbiology. We need much better science education in our schools. We need to energize young people with an interest in working in these fields. This is an extremely important field where the fields of microbiology intersect with public health and ecology. We don't want to separate ourselves from the natural world in order to sterilize ourselves for the sake of safety. You're absolutely right. We need to remain unified with the natural world in relatively non-disruptive ways. We need to understand that there are microbes everywhere. There are viruses everywhere. There are bacteria everywhere. Many of them are benign. Some of them are necessary to us. Some of them can be dangerous. It's a magnificently exciting and important field, microbiology and molecular biology, and we need more of our young people energized and given the opportunities to go into those fields, to do work that includes but goes far beyond the field of protecting us against infectious disease.
Thank you, David. General?
Sorry, Melanie, can I just quickly pick up on that? Because
sure.
I think, yeah, it's a great question, and it relates to the One Health that we were talking about earlier. We need to see ourselves as integral with nature and the environment, and we shouldn't be waging war on any level of the environment, whether it's the microbes on our body, the microbes in our body, which are absolutely, we need them to survive. But we wage war outside that in our homes. Let me ask you all, how many of you have cans of doom and other poisons in your house that you liberally spray around on insects and everything else? And then, industrial agriculture. We spray poisons all over the lands and fields and our own food crops. We spray poisons that destroy the pollinators, which pollinated those crops. So we have to move away from this idea that we're at war with nature. We have to understand that we're part of it, and that goes from the microbiology to the macrobiology.
Thank you, Nick. Honorable Holomisa.
Thank you, Melanie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
First of all, I think we should say thank you to you for this initiative to discuss these issues. Secondly, mine is just to map a sort of a way forward. I would strongly recommend that the Department of Environmental Affairs and any other related department should organize a roundtable discussion to view this, the effects of this pandemic, and in particular to be briefed thoroughly by the scientists we have in this country, and possibly invite any other scientists from outside, even from China for that matter, so that we take a firm decision from an informed position, which will shape our future environment policy on the issues related to biodiversity. I know that we are one of the richest countries in biodiversity, but we might have an opportunity right now to unpack these policies and simplify them for our own people. In the past, they have been seen to be the policies which are meant for rich people, people who own game farms. But the virus we've seen sees no boundaries. So mine is just to say the Department of Environment and possibly the Portfolio Committee should spearhead such a roundtable discussion, which might end up in a mini conference for South Africans, where there is a need to adjust some laws. Then those laws would be adjusted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General. I'm not sure, Nick, do you want to comment on that? I presume you will agree.
Yeah, I'd agree very much. I would hate to see this initiative sort of just disappear after this debate. It's been fantastic, and we really need to take it forward. So I really welcome the General's comments. It's a fantastic suggestion. So yes, please, let's do that.
Just before I pass on to the chairperson, the Honourable Mbata has asked whether she could just make a very short comment. She wanted to just say one more thing that she forgot earlier. I hope that's okay. Honourable Mbata.
Thank you, Melanie. The short thing that small thing that I have forgotten, it's about the safety of the employees. Because while we are talking about this zoonotic diseases or spillover, but we must make sure that those people employed in those areas where there are wild animals, they must get proper personal protective equipment, and they must be trained on how to use that PPE, and they must be trained on the spillover or the zoonotic diseases, that the hazard that they might have. And the other thing is that, which is very important, I've seen that is not being done. The vaccines, continuous vaccines on infectious control, and the continuous medical examination. I wanted to say that so that the whole country must know that we are not only interested on the wildlife, but also on the human beings that are working with the wildlife in order for them to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nick and David, I presume you're okay with that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, for sure. Very important, thank you, Honourable Member.
I'm going to pass over to the chairperson now, Honourable Fikile Xhasa, who is sitting in Mobile, I think. So he's on a phone because of the Wi-Fi network not being very strong in his area. And I would ask him to make some concluding remarks, and then I will just wrap up after that. Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Melanie. members of parliament from South Africa, who are my colleagues, our two guest speakers. Let me appreciate the presentations by both speakers, and the topic itself was quite interesting. I'm sure most of us, as the general has indicated, there was a lot of learning that we went through the presentations and the engagements that came out of it. There are many reasons linked to conservation, animal welfare, wider matters of ethics and public health, including risks posed by zoonotic diseases that should be considered in the regulation of wildlife trade in the aftermath of the COVID-19. So I'm sure all of us as members of parliament, we can see what might be expected of us. There is a strong case for increased regulation, even on pure economic grounds, considering the fact that there's a lot that we lost out of this pandemic. I'm sure the two speakers actually indicated very well that we'll have to find a way to surveil on this thing of wild trade. It is quite critical to protect global health and the risks associated with live animal trade. But equally, there was a message that says to us, it can never be completely be eliminated, this thing of wildlife trade. But we can deal with illegal wildlife trade. I think out of that message, we should be taking some lessons. As public representatives, there's a lot that we need to do in order to make the public aware about first the cause of the pandemic and many other pandemics that could have come before us. There's a lot that we need to do in terms of making people aware. There's a lot that we can do in terms of legislation, whether we're talking national, in our case, continental, as well as global. Our speakers did indicate what would be the weaknesses in terms of if we focus on national, we might have to trade with the rest of the world. So there is need for cooperation across the globe to deal with some of this. So in other words, there's no one answer. Obviously, if we talk way forward, as a committee, we will have to come together and see what do we do beyond the pandemic. And beyond the committee, obviously, we are interacting with the department. And I'm saying beyond the department or beyond national, we have to interact with our brothers in the continent and globally in order for us to deal with this pandemic. But the session itself, I would like to thank Melanie for facilitating it, as well as the participation by the two speakers and the members of parliament from South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. A big thank you also from my side to the speakers. Thank you also to the members of parliament. There is a big responsibility on your shoulders to safeguard future generations from similar pandemics. And I think it's important, if anything comes from this today, it's important that it be known that it's not only about those who are dealing with the economy and those who are dealing with health, but that those who deal with environmental issues should be central when it comes to dealing with these pandemics. I want to thank everybody who also joined us on YouTube. We've had a very big response there. Thank you very much. And to say that we also hope that we will have similar briefings like these in future for members of parliament. We look forward to seeing you there again soon. And we hope that in the meantime, you stay safe. And goodbye.